So today we're going to do an Nvidia RTX 3080 build guide. Now the point of this build guide is going to be basically for maximum performance in terms of no CPU bottlenecking, or at least minimizing it as much as possible, as well as pretty much the most optimized gaming experience that you can have. We're going to do an Intel build as well as an AMD build. So let's get started. Remember to subscribe for more content like this, smash that like button, and let's get right into it. Alright guys, so today we're going to be tackling Nvidia's RTX 3080. Now, even though there's a 3090 coming right after it, the 3080 more or less is what Nvidia considers a reasonable high-end card, sort of their top-of-the-line mainstream gaming card. The 3090, yes, it's much more powerful, much more expensive. It has much more Titan level performance. Maybe somebody who wants to use a 3090 is going to do gaming, maybe some content creation. So today we're going to be focusing on the 3080, which is pretty much the sweet spot for high-end gaming. We're going to be building sort of the ultimate build that's going to take the best advantage of something like a 3080. And when I say this, I don't mean necessarily the most expensive components. I mean the components that are outright going to perform the best. Sometimes it is the most expensive, sometimes it's not. So basically we're just looking to get the best performance here without any significant bottlenecks, and pretty much a build that's going to do well at 1080p high refresh rate gaming, 1440p ultra wide, as well as 4K gaming. So with this RTX 3080 build, you're going to be able to tackle pretty much any resolution and any frame rate you're going to throw at it. Basically, our guiding point is going to be 4K high refresh rate, 144 Hertz. If you can do 4K high refresh rate, you're definitely going to be able to do 1440p, and you're definitely going to be able to do 1080p as well, especially considering what a monster GPU that the 3080 is. Now we're going to split this build up into an Intel build as well as an AMD build. Now theoretically the Intel build should be the higher performing one just because of higher IPC and higher clocks on the CPU, but AMD Ryzen presents such a great value for performance, and a lot of their chips actually are really catching up to Intel, that I think it's necessary to have an AMD build in there as well. A lot of people are going to be using AMD motherboards, and let's not forget that Ryzen 4000, which will be announced next month, is supposed to have higher clocks. It's supposed to perform a lot closer to the current Intel gaming chips. So that means if you get an X570 motherboard now, you're going to be pretty much future-proof, at least for Ryzen 4000. So just keep that in mind. If you want to wait until Ryzen 4000 releases, and that's definitely a good idea, you can go ahead and do that. Or if you want the best existing gaming performance, you'll choose one of the Intel chips or one of the AMD Ryzen chips that currently will get the job done as well. And just a note, for every component that I mentioned for this build, I'll try to mention at least an alternative or a secondary component that I think will also perform well, because in the real world, when you're looking for parts, sometimes something might be hard to find, it might be sold out, or there may be something that's slightly cheaper, it may present a similar value. So I'll at least give you guys those options. I don't want to give you just one build with all the ultimate stuff and then stuff is hard to get, or maybe people don't like it. So at least you can be a little more flexible and you'll get a pretty good idea of what you need to do an ultimate build. So first, let's get started with the Intel build. Now this is going to be none other than the 10900K. This is a 10-core, 20-thread monster CPU that has a turbo clock all the way up to 5.3 gigahertz, high clock speeds, high IPC. That's what we want for gaming across the board. And of course, it doesn't hurt to have those multiple cores in some games, like maybe Battlefield 5 or certain games that can take advantage of a little bit more multi-threaded workloads. So now the 10900K, in my opinion, is definitely the best gaming CPU if you're looking for the ultimate performance to pair with a 3080. With a CPU like this, you really don't have to worry about bottlenecking issues at 1080p, 1440p, ultra wide, 4K. It's pretty much going to handle whatever you throw at it. And with a 10900K, you can pretty much rest assured that it's going to take full advantage of whatever the RTX 3080 will be able to do, at least until some other faster CPU comes out in the future. So for now, I think for a gaming system that you're trying to minimize bottlenecks and get the best performance possible out of many varied resolutions, 10900K is definitely the one to go with. Now, I do realize a 10900K is a little bit more expensive than maybe some of the other Intel CPUs. As an alternative, they did release a 10850K, which is very similar performance, a little bit cheaper, so you could look into that as well. Even possibly a 10700K, depending on your budget, if it's the only thing you can find. Now, if we start talking about a possible 10700K, That's great as well. Those perform great, but then we start to get into more of like a price to performance ratio. With this build, we're really trying to keep it almost as like an ultimate gaming build. So that's why I'm going to recommend the 10900K, just because then you don't have to question yourself if you have any possible bottlenecks along the way. It's pretty much bar none going to give you the most performance we can currently get out of an RTX 3080 with a paired up CPU like a 10900K. Now, when we get down to motherboards, once again, I'm not going to choose necessarily the most expensive. I'm just going to choose the one that I think performs the best with a 10900K. Personally, even in the build back here, I actually do have a 10900K, and it's running on an Asus Apex motherboard. Now, this motherboard, in my opinion, is very flexible. It has a lot of the usual stuff that you would want on a motherboard, like Wi-Fi as well as USB ports. But one of the main things is that, especially with a chip like a 10900K that can overclock really well, this board is meant for overclocking and to really pushing a gaming chip like the 10900K to the edge. So that's why I think a board like this is absolutely fantastic. But as an alternative, I think most of the more high-end motherboards will be able to handle this just fine. I don't think you'll have any issues at all. Even like an Asus Strix or a Gigabyte Master or MSI, the Meg Ace, any of those motherboards should be able to more or less give you a very close performance. Something like the Apex is just going to allow you to overclock a little more. It has certain tools, but motherboards, I wouldn't worry too much as long as you get a nice high-quality motherboard. You don't want to get a cheap one, especially not with a 10900K, because then you can start to run into some issues with VRM cooling and other issues with your processor that a motherboard that's a little more high-end is going to be able to much better manage. And of course, since we're talking about motherboards, I must address the question of PCIe Generation 3 versus Generation 4. As you'll see, X570 on AMD already has PCIe Generation 4, but Nvidia recently even cleared up this sort of confusion. If you need Generation 4, you don't need it. It's not necessary in order for the new RTX GPUs to be compatible. And right now, so pretty much PCIe Generation 4 is going to give you pretty much almost all of the performance that a GPU like this is going to be able to produce. PCIe Generation 4 still isn't at the point where the bottleneck is going to be massive compared to Generation 3. So while yes, there have been tests even on the 2080 Ti, even though I know the 2080 Ti is kind of dunzo after the 3070 came out, but it used to be a high-end GPU, I guess, even though I still think it's pretty good. But regardless, even tests were done. I think Hardware Unboxing, the other tech review channel, they saw a couple of percentage difference between Generation 3 and 4, but according to Nvidia, you shouldn't really worry about the difference between Generation 3 and 4 because certain processors, and I think they were alluding to something like the 10900K, having that higher clock speed is most likely going to be more important now than having something like PCIe Generation 4. Maybe proof of this is that all of the Nvidia benchmarks were using a 10900K. So if Generation 4 was such a big issue and it was going to be a huge bottleneck on Generation 3, I think they definitely would have done Generation 4, but even seeing their benchmarks, and of course they want to get the best numbers possible, doing it with a 10900K kind of proves that that's sort of the ultimate gaming CPU that you're going to be able to use on the system. Now, as we move into the RAM selection, first, I believe that for gaming, 16 gigabytes is more than enough. You can get 32 gigabytes if it sort of fits your budget and maybe if you're going to do some content creation, but since this is primarily going to be a gaming build, we're going to look for high quality RAM, 2 sticks of 8 gigabytes each for a total of 16 gigabyte. Remember that Z490 is going to be dual channel as opposed to something like X299, which is quad channel. So here, the RAM that I really like using on these type of builds, the first one is going to be the Corsair Dominator RGB. First of all, aesthetically, I think this RAM looks absolutely awesome. You get a lot of control over the lighting, and then plus it performs really, really well. Maybe if you get a speed around 3600 megahertz, maybe that's around the sweet spot. You could go with 3200 megahertz. That doesn't make as big of a difference in gaming, and some games you'll get a little bit more here or there. So I would say 3600 megahertz, pretty much the sweet spot. As an alternative, you could look at something like G-Skill RAM. I love the Triton Z RGB RAM, or even the Royal RAM. They look really, really nice. Likewise, around 3600 megahertz, I think would be the sweet spot. Even 3200 megahertz is fine in most situations. I don't think you really have to go over 4000. If you really want to overclock and push it, yeah, you can do it, but then you may start running into other issues as well as your RAM speeds get higher. So that's why I think the sweet spot is right around 3600 megahertz. Just make sure to get a nice quality set of RAM, and I think you'll be more than fine. And since this is an ultimate gaming build, we really want to be gaming all the time, and we don't want to wait for files to load or transfer buffers to load. So here we're going to be using at least 2 NVMe drives. NVMe drives are going to be considerably faster than 2.5-inch SSD drives, and in general I think the prices have gotten down to a pretty reasonable level where you can get a 1 terabyte or even a 2 terabyte NVMe drive. Maybe you can use one, even a smaller one, to store your operating system, and have a second one so you can store your games on and your files. The reason to get NVMe, first of all, they're really fast. They seem to be very reliable. You have a lot less cable clutter around in your system, and if you're picking up one of the high-end Asus motherboards like the Apex that I mentioned, it even has a little DIMM.2 riser where you can actually put 2 NVMe drives right there. So even if it's water cooled or you have your GPUs in there, you can sort of easily take everything out. That's why I think, aside from the great performance advantages of NVMe drives, it's actually very practical as well. Like I said, you don't have to run SATA cables or power cables or motherboard cables. They just slot right into the motherboard and really give you ultimate performance. I personally have always liked the Samsung ones, the 970 EVO. Keep in mind the 980 series should be releasing, and it's going to be very fast, but right now all we really have available is maybe like the 970 EVO, 970 Pro. And as alternatives, of course, you'll find a decent amount of other NVMe drives on the market. Another one that's been great for gaming is something like the WD Black Series, the 750N. You can get that in 1 terabyte in different sizes. So as long as you get a high quality performance NVMe drive, I think you'll be okay. Some of the cheaper ones like the Intel 660p, the price is definitely attractive. Some of the speeds are reasonable, but I think they tend to get a little bit bogged down when they get full and when you're doing a lot of transfers. So maybe I would avoid those for sort of an ultimate gaming build like this. I would definitely go towards some of the more high-end NVMe drives like the ones from Samsung that I mentioned, and that way you will ensure that you're not really going to get any bottlenecks at all in your system. And then we're going to get down to the power supply. Now, these new Nvidia RTX GPUs are pretty power hungry, definitely a lot more than the 20 series generation. Still, I don't think you have to go necessarily overboard and overkill. I think the minimum they recommend for something like a 3080 is maybe 750 watts, but I think I would get, for a build like this, at least 1,000 watts just to make sure we have a lot of headroom, especially if we're going to be overclocking our CPU. In the future, we want to leave this build open. Let's say we're going to upgrade to something like a 3090, so we definitely want to have the most headroom possible with the power supply. So I would say I would get at least 1,000 watt power supply. Of course, you can get away with doing 750 or 850, but for a build like this, why not just go a little more and get something like 1,000 watt power supply? That way you just know you'll have massive amounts of headroom. Now, the power supply, as long as you get a high quality power supply, you should be okay. Some that I've tried recently that I think are really nice and high end, from the presentation to the actual performance, the Main Gear Ignition power supply comes in both at 1,000 watts as well as 1,200 watts. I love the unboxing experience. I actually did a video on this previously. Very nice power supply. Everything about it I think matches this type of build really well, especially being such a high-end powerful power supply. You can throw pretty much whatever you want at it. It's not going to have any issues at all. Some other alternatives, companies like Be Quiet make awesome power supplies as well. They look aesthetically really nice, as well as having really low noise, very high quality components. And then of course the standard EVGA power supplies, especially if you get something from their Gold series, or Corsair if you get something that's gold or platinum. Of course, with a build like this, you want to try to get as modular as possible. If you can do it fully modular, that's the best way. That just means that basically you can take out all of the cables. Nothing's actually attached to the power supply permanently. You can take out the cables, so if you're not using certain cables, you can really minimize the amount of clutter that you have in there. And in the future, if you add different components, you could always pop cables back in, and that way it's a very streamlined experience. And now just a note on actually cooling your CPU. I personally would water cool it just because that's what I love doing. If you guys check out some of the other videos on my channel, I've done so many water cooled builds. I really like water cooling, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite to have the ultimate performance. In this case, I kind of have to leave it up to you. I would just say, especially with a chip like a 10900K, I would go with at least a 280 or 360 millimeter radiator. If you're doing something like an AIO, you can get away with an air cooler if it's very high quality, like the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4. I've actually used that on a 10900K without any issues at all. You could also use the Noctua air coolers. Just make sure for a build like this, you get something very high quality, like those two air coolers that I mentioned, or a very high quality AIO. Otherwise, if you like water cooling, this is definitely the build to do it in. And then lastly, let's talk about some case choices. Primarily, this is a little bit more open-ended, but I would definitely, at a very minimum, get something that's considered to be a very high-quality case. Basically, you want something that's going to have a decent amount of room so you get some nice airflow for your 3080, or if you're going to be water cooling it, something that can sort of support different radiators. I'll just mention a few cases that I've done builds in that I really like recently. For example, behind me here is the Be Quiet, the Dark Base 700. I also did a build in the smaller 600. These are very quiet cases. They still have very respectable airflow, and a case like this, when you're pairing with like an ultimate gaming build that even has the RGB on the side, I mean, I don't know what else you could want. Absolutely gorgeous case, very high build quality. Likewise, Fractal Design makes great cases, maybe like the Meshify S2 or something like that, or even the Define R6, especially if you're going to be air cooling. And then of course, if you can get your hands on a case like a Case Labs SMA8, that's definitely the ultimate gaming build. That's what I'm going to be using for the 3080 until I get the 3090. Then that's going to go in that Case Labs build. The 3080 is going to go in this Be Quiet 700 build. So as long as you get a very high quality case that has a decent amount of airflow and is nice to build in, this is a little bit more open-ended, but those are the cases I've used and can suggest to you as well. And now, likewise, let's talk about the AMD side of things, if that's the direction that you want to go into. Remember, almost everything that I spoke about for the Intel build, including the case and coolers and RAM, most of that is all going to apply as well to the AMD build as well. The only difference here really is the motherboard and the processor choice as well, so let's get into that. Now, personally, for my own high-end AMD build, I'm using an MSI Godlike X570 with a 3950X. In my opinion, that's the absolute best Ryzen processor that you can get your hands on right now. 16 core, 32 threads, it clocks very nicely, it actually does pretty well in gaming, but for a purely gaming build, I think I might have to recommend the 3800 XT, which is the one that more recently came out, just because I believe this is one of the only Ryzen chips that's going to be able to boost fairly high, maybe around that 4.7 gigahertz range, getting it a lot closer to the Intel range. So if you want to do this as an ultimate gaming build, I think the 3800 XT is going to be absolutely the most streamlined and best performing AMD chip that you're going to be able to get for now. Keep in mind that Ryzen 4000 is being announced on October 8th, so we're very close. So if you really want to do an AMD Ryzen build for the ultimate gaming build, I would suggest waiting a few weeks, because these new processors, as far as things that I've seen so far, they're going to be generally clocking significantly higher, maybe even having something like the 3950X, but higher clocking. That would definitely be very exciting, and possibly, depending on how well these new chips perform, they can take a lot of that performance difference in gaming that Intel currently holds. So if you're planning on going AMD, I would wait a little bit. I would only maybe build a build like this now if you're dead set on going Intel and you just definitely want the highest frames per second possible, because that definitely, the 10900K is still sort of undisputed in that category. It still performs fantastically well for gaming. Might be a little while before AMD eventually overtakes them, but definitely Ryzen 4000, very interesting, coming soon. But if you have to build now, the 3800 XT is going to be Ryzen's best gaming CPU at the moment, with the 3950X being the ultimate CPU for not only gaming, but whatever else you may want to throw at it. But for pure gaming, 3800 XT. And for the motherboard, I did mention I am using the X570 MSI Godlike, but I don't necessarily recommend this motherboard for this build, because first, I think it's a little bit too expensive for what you get, and a lot of that stuff is geared a little bit more towards content creation. You get these add-in cards, 10 gigabyte networking. Here, we're talking about the ultimate gaming build, so I would save that cost, and if you do want to do MSI, maybe get the MSI Ace, the X570. Perhaps the Gigabyte Master X570 is a fantastic motherboard. And then of course, Asus, the Formula motherboard is incredible. I used to have one for Z390, and the X570 looks pretty much just as good. The Strix motherboard, any of those, X570 is going to give you PCIe Generation 4, and this also is a little bit different with the NVMe, because you can get Generation 4 NVMEs. A few companies make Generation 4 NVMEs, and they're fantastic. So if you're going with AMD at this time, I would get something like that over like a Samsung Evo. I know Corsair makes the NVMe Generation 4. Gigabyte makes it as well. And then of course the X570 motherboards do have this generation 4, so if there is going to be a little bump in GPU performance being generation 4 in the future, you're going to be ready to take that on. Even though right now, as I mentioned before, it's not a huge deal at the moment, you generally just want to find a higher performing and clocking CPU in order to mostly take advantage of whatever gaming you're going to be throwing at it. Otherwise, pretty much all of the component selections I mentioned with Intel can apply directly to this AMD build. Even the 3600 megahertz RAM, you want to get something like the Triton Z, maybe the Neo, which apparently is more optimized for AMD Ryzen processors, but Corsair Dominator can also do that at 3600 megahertz. Is a nice sweet spot for Ryzen RAM, so you definitely want to be around that speed. But otherwise, aside from the motherboard, CPU, possibly the NVMe drive, everything else is very, very similar between these two builds, of course including the RTX 3080. That's the superstar of these builds. So now, if you're doing an RTX 3080, sort of an ultimate gaming build, you have all the information that you need to make your decision. Go Intel for sort of the highest, no holds barred, no bottlenecking performance. Go AMD with a little more balance, and knowing that the Ryzen 4000 will be coming out very, very shortly, so knowing that you may want to wait a little bit. But otherwise, that's pretty much all you need to know for the ultimate RTX 3080 build. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed the content. Let me know if you have any questions below. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.